Hello. Hi, Clara. Hi, Kevin. All right. Let's see here. Um, Hopefully we get some others to join us. So we are doing the American War for Independence today, okay? So I want to go ahead and share the page with a couple things here. So notice what I hold to be the names. Right. So we have the as what I hold to be um, relevant context to the War for Independence, no matter what you take as your interpretation. Okay, and so what's some of the data that I personally think that's almost universally relevant. Well, for one, right, is you have demographic changes in the 1700s, a population explosion, as well as changes both within the cities, explosion in the cities like Philadelphia, Boston, New York, just big explosion in numbers. You have big movements of people from the eastern cities out into the frontiers, and you have issues that go with that as well. A lot of them that moved into the frontiers, they felt a sense of kind of entitlement, but juxtaposed with a sense of inferiority. Like, hey, what about us? We want to be we want to be uh, uh, represented as well as everybody else. And so they fought for their representation and their rights, along with everybody that was represented in the eastern part of their colony. And but then you also had people, like I said, who were the population was booming in the eastern parts of the cities. So you find that in Howard Zinn, his People's History of the U.S. You find that happening, and yeah, we're gonna get more into that. So you have a growing sense along with that of class consciousness, as to use kind of a Marxist type term. Jacob, welcome. Class consciousness of the a class of conspicuous wealth developed by the 1740s and 50s of leisure, of buying luxury goods, um, distinguishing themselves from the masses, um, and kind of disdainfully looking down upon the the mobs of people in the cities, and disdainfully toward the country folk out to the west. All right. So that will play into things to a lot of people, to some more than to others, historians. And but one thing as well is, at the end of the French and Indian War, the British find themselves with a vast, enhanced empire to administer. And now they're thinking, man, this population has grown exponentially. Um, it's vastly become enhanced as far as the geographical expanse of it. And we need to take some measures to control it, to administrate it. Okay, so that's going to have an effect on the War for Independence. All right. Then you also have the next part in the next paragraph is political ambiguity, right? Unclearness, right? Lack of distinctive awareness as to what it means to be a subject under the British Crown. Because subject, right, was a term they used. They didn't have the term citizen yet. So to be a subject, right, under the British Crown, that was to have the rights that were afforded an Englishman, right, at that time. Remember that the English common law and the English political constitution was an amalgamation. It was an added, a mixture of lots of things. It was not one written document that we're accustomed to today as American citizens. It was a combination of royal edicts by kings and queens, right, and the tradition thereof in English history. And by the way, they could make royal edicts and then take them away. So what was granted by one crown could be taken away by a subsequent crown. So they weren't set in stone. Then you also had parliamentary law, right? You had judicial decisions, okay? And so you have all these things combining, and they grew like a plant, right? So it was seen as organic. It was always growing, always morphing, always evolving, this sense of law, okay? And so, for instance, here in the colonies, they began making decisions saying, okay, well, we think it is by place of birth alone, okay? So just solely. So if you're born under the under the British Commonwealth, then you should be given the right of a subject. But then in other decisions, they said, no, we beg to differ. It should be based upon your father's blood, jus sanguinis, right? And then they said, no, but then it must be by both parents. And then they went back to, no, just one parent is enough, mother or father. And so it was constantly evolving, right? And then to add to this ambiguity is you had the Virginia Company, and they were granted by King James I, stating that those who operate under the Virginia Company shall be granted all the rights of subjectship, those who operate with that Virginia Company. And so they're like, wow, okay, that's great. They are to be treated the same as English subjects back in England itself, right? But then James doesn't do the same for anybody else as he did there in Virginia. William Penn offered the same in Pennsylvania. So it wasn't offered everywhere in all the colonies. It was a bit sporadic, right? And so hence that term that I use, it's ambiguous, right? What exact rights do the colonists have? Are they English subjects, technically, afforded the rights of Englishmen here in the American colonies? And when they find precedents with a C that are made as far as judicial decisions, right, that are passed in Scotland, because there were some big ones made in Scotland, right, that afforded the rights of Englishmen to Scots, again born in under the British Commonwealth. Did that apply to them as well, under the same principle? Or does that, or the Scots in a special category, because under 1707, Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland uniquely became Great Britain, and the northern colonies, Australia, etc., were termed uniquely different as the colonial dominion of Great Britain, but not Great Britain itself, as those other entities were and still are. So you see what I mean? There was a lot of room left for conjecture as far as what the rights really were of American colonists. So I think that left room for future conflict and disagreement. All right. And then you have, let's see here, what do I have here in this last one? Protests, government became much more alarmingly ubiquitous in England. Oh, and then you have protest in England itself. You had the Rotten Borough movement. Okay. And with the Rotten Borough movement, it was led by a guy named John Wilkes. And he said that there were a lot of boroughs or districts that didn't get to elect a single person to represent them in Parliament. This is back in England itself, right? So there was anger about that. Then King George III, when he came to the throne, he was the third in line of his dynasty that was Germanic. And so his father and his grandfather, they were not likely well received either, because they had been invited in from Germany. Okay. So they still weren't, he still wasn't well received, even as a third one. In addition to that, he openly, George III, bribed people to win over to his policies and to his political party. He was clearly a conservative. He was a Tory, as the Tory party was known to be conservative. And there were some well-known Whigs who were the Liberal Party, WHIG, who were basically bought over and became Tories. And it was pretty evident to the public that they had been literally bought by King George III to become Tories. The man I mentioned, John Wilkes, was such a rabble rouser. And when he was elected by his, quote, Rotten Borough, and he was saying he was going to make a lot of noise in Parliament and make a big difference for the common poor man in England, King George III said he is not sitting in the House of Commons. He's trouble. And he refused to allow the House of Commons to let him have a seat. And he threatened to have him arrested. And so he was not allowed to sit in the House of Commons, despite the fact of being rightfully, legitimately elected by his peers. So there were people back in England who were calling George III a foreign tyrant. He was not the most popular of kings in England itself, and he had enemies back at home. And we knew that overseas. And there was a newspaper that really became a thorn in George III's side, and it was known as Cato's Letters. Cato being a symbol of opposition to tyranny, going back to Rome. And these two guys named Gordon and Trenchard, Trenchard, Gordon and Trenchard, they had this newspaper. And mind you, they had to be on the run because they were not afforded their freedom of the press. They were threatened to be shut down and arrested. But they would call George III out on his dealings. And they would cite these beliefs, these values that were percolating in the mid to late 1700s from the Enlightenment and from the Scottish Enlightenment. When I say the Enlightenment, I'm mainly talking about the French Enlightenment and the Scottish Enlightenment. And they would show how he was violating those beliefs. Well, Benjamin Franklin had a chance to meet with the editors of their paper. And he traveled to Europe to meet them. And he had them printed here in America. He wanted the Americans to read Cato's letters and read what George III was up to back in England and his misdeeds. All right. And then, of course, that which came right up to the beginning of the actual War for Independence were the series of taxes, right? That led to the rebellion itself. So with that, I'd like to go to my PowerPoint. I may not hit every tax, but you guys will get the point. Look at this. The French and Indian War ends, right? And the British are 137 million shillings in debt. And their annual budget is only 8 million shillings. During the war, they had fought here in North America, primarily. They had asked every colonial assembly. Okay. Remember, the assembly was the elected legislator of every colony of the colonists, right? Our voices, our spokesmen, our elected reps. They had asked them to gather a certain number of soldiers to help fight with them against the French, and to gather a certain amount of money, tax revenue, to help pay for this war against the French. And by the way, the British, they could not deny that they were primarily fighting for themselves, right? To gain domination, hegemony over North America. But what they stated, right, is that this would in turn benefit us, because we would enjoy greater economic benefits and greater political liberties under them than we ever would have under the French. So that it was in our best interest, they argued, for the British, to win, right? So, according to Alan Brinkley's textbook, not a single assembly garnered even close to the amount of tax revenue that was asked of it, or even close to the number of men, fighting men, that was asked of it, right? In addition to that, there were quite a few cases, highly publicized, of smuggling going on, of smuggling with the French enemy in the Caribbean during this war. And instead of the cases of British smuggling with the enemy being highly publicized, the most salient, the one that stood out the most and the most often, were cases of Americans making money selling contraband to the French. So word gets back to the British, you guys, the general public, etc., right? And we look like a bunch of ingrates, spoiled ingrates, who need to be put in our place. So the war is over. Certainly no thanks to us. The British have won, right? They're largely indebted. Okay. And so now they need to regain some revenue, they need to also gain a sense of peace with the Native Americans, because so many of the native tribes either were indifferent to the British or hostile to the British and were with the French. And that's costly, literally costly, economically. So they're trying to win over the natives diplomatically, militarily, economically. So here are a couple of the first things they do. They issue the Proclamation of 1763. They state Americans cannot cross the Appalachians. And the Appalachians, right? I should have had a map here. But the Appalachians, you have, picture the Atlantic coast, okay? And then over here is the Mississippi. The Appalachians are right in the middle, right here. So they cannot cross the Appalachians. So the Appalachians and then Mississippi right here. So they cannot cross the Appalachians and go anywhere toward the Mississippi. Okay. The Americans are furious over it. And why is that? It's a common theme in American history, early American history. For the have-nots, for the ambitious, the chance to start anew is to head west and squat on Western land, right? Even if it's not your land, even if it's Native American land, head west. So now the British are telling them they can't do it. So they're furious, right? But the British, they're not in the mood right now. They're like, no, we don't want no drama with the natives. That land between the Appalachians and the Mississippi, that belongs to the natives. It's too expensive to engage in war, and we're in no mood to ingratiate the Americans. They haven't earned it. Then the Sugar Act. We're going to put a tax on sugar, paint, several other small commodities. And by the way, in almost every case, the actual tax was very nominal, very slight. Okay. But this was pretty big here, though. Customs officials, they were like the highway patrolmen. They're part of the Naval Department, and they were to catch smuggling. But it was a stepping stone office, you guys. It did not, the remuneration, the pay was poor. But it was a stepping stone to a much better office. So to a lot of people, it was a necessary evil to get to a position that they coveted after it. And so they did not enjoy that position. It was a means to an end. And so a lot of them were not even, that says it right there. In the act, they said, customs officials, you have to return to your posts. That just tells you how many of them must not even have been at their posts and doing their job, right? And then the ones who were at their posts, it was so common that they would turn a blind eye with their hand out and say, okay, I didn't see you, for how much? And they would ask for a bribe. And a lot of Americans would just offer them a bribe and they'd accept it. But now it became more difficult to do. Okay, so now they're starting to crack down on the Americans. So then they renewed a general writ, right? A general, warrant that they could stop ships and enter them and search, see what they have aboard, and make sure that they had the proper papers for what they were doing. Because remember, technically, right, there was no capitalist economy yet, you guys. This technically was mercantilism. You had to have the right papers and the right connections to obtain those papers to trade in a given commodity. All right. So enumerated goods are just specified goods that have a tax on them. They were broadened to hides, iron, timber, etc. Right. And 8 colonial assemblies petitioned that this was causing economic injury to them. But that's it so far. That's it so far. All right. And then you have the I'm not going over every detail, okay? And then 1764, you have the Currency Act. No colonial paper could be printed. Okay, and then the Stamp Act. Now, again, the Stamp Act, you only paid for that when you purchased or had printed an official document. So this hit people that were a store owner, a lawyer, a journalist, etc. It just hit certain demographics, but those demographics were well organized. But boy, did they organize others well. Colonel Isaac Barr, he was back in England, and he hears a guy arrogantly give a speech. And he says, Americans, you are children, we have nurtured from the beginning. And we have nurtured until you have grown strong. And now that you've grown up, now it's time for you to help pay us back. And so we therefore have the right to tax you from Parliament. And it's time to pay back to your guardian, your parent, right? And Colonel Isaac Barr stands up in the House of Commons. And see, Isaac Barr had been to the colonies back and forth. He had family in the colonies. And so his heart, his emotional loyalty came out very much for the colonies, even though he was there living in Britain. And he shot back. And he said, you think, this is a loose paraphrase, okay, but you think you have strengthened us? He said, we were left to our own devices. The natives tried to kill us. We were left to the vagaries of the weather and the Native American attacks. We hardened our constitution and our resolve. We built our own places, and we were like children left on our own. And after all these years, we've strengthened ourselves, and we became independent. And now you want to come and take money out of our pockets? And he says, I don't think so. And I thought that was very indicative of the two very different views of the Americans and the British at this time, So, and by the way, the Stamp Act, you also have at this time the opening of the difference between direct representation and virtual representation, right? You probably have heard that. That is going to enter the common, debate. What's the word I'm thinking of? It's another word that they use more often, and it's eluding me right now. I apologize. But it enters it at this time, what people are talking about. Direct representation is just that. The people directly elect one of their own, right? Who actually represents them. The British say, well, you come from British line ethnically and nationally and historically. You are a part of the British institutional system. So therefore, the people in Parliament, they virtually represent you. And so they have the right to virtually, say and do what's best for you. And as you can imagine, to the Americans, that was not good enough. That didn't hold water. Patrick Henry and the Assembly of Virginia, because remember each colony had the lower house of elected reps in the Assembly. In Virginia, it's called the House of Burgesses. Then they had a governor who sometimes was handpicked and sometimes was elected. And then the governor usually got to handpick his councilmen. So you had the Assembly, then the upper house of councilmen, and a governor in each of the colonies. Patrick Henry was 29 years old, a young buck. And he liked attention, it seems to be. But he said that he mentioned 2 or 3 tyrants in history who met their demise, and he hinted that George III was going to meet his. And someone yelled, treason, but he was saying basically that there had to have been, they had to allow, he could not go backwards, right? That George III in Parliament could not go backwards. That for years, the Virginia Assembly had been taxing its own Virginia people. And they could not now take that from the Virginia Assembly and give it to Parliament 3,000 miles across the ocean, when not a single Virginia man was in Parliament or had elected anyone to Parliament. All right. So the Assembly of Virginia said they would not collect the tax, the stamp tax. They would not pay it, have anybody pay it, because their assembly had not okayed it. Rhode Island did the same, said that it was unconstitutional. Massachusetts was interesting. James Otis first was all about not taking away the rights of the assembly. And then at the key juncture, right when the things got heated, he folded. And he said that Parliament does have the right to do it for us. And there was such anger toward him. And then there was a man named Thomas Hutchinson, who was like a lieutenant governor. And he wrote a letter to the governor, Bernard. And he said, you know what? We need to take away rights of these people in Boston for a while, just to send a message that they need to be put in their place. They need to know who's in charge. And it's the king's men. It's the Tories. It's those who stay loyal to the crown and to Mother England. And somehow Benjamin Franklin got a hold of that letter and he gave it to the press. And the people were so angry with him over that they went to his house, and thankfully for him, he like literally within minutes left before the mob got there to kill him. And I kid you not. And but the mob went on just ransacking the nice British homes in Boston, and it's going to lead to the British pretty soon here, to the British dissolving the Massachusetts Assembly. So at any rate, you had the Stamp Act Congress. 9 different assemblies met and said that they'll only collect taxes if their assemblies collect the tax. Sons of Liberties chapters began forming in several New England states at first, and they were for not necessarily non-violent. They were for civil disobedience. So tarring and feathering, boycotting, strikes, mob violence. Yeah, you name it. They did the famous Tea Party, etc. All right, let's see here. So they tried the Townshend Acts, which were external only, and that didn't work either. Notice Sam Adams, they tried a circular, which will result in the committees of correspondence, and that was big. With the circular and the later committees of correspondence, what they do is that it's a pledge from colony to colony that they're going to have one another's back. That when something happens with one colony, they're going to immediately report it to the other colonies, and they're going to help one another. And that's going to be a thorn in the side of the British, right? That's going to be the great fear of George III, because he's going to say on a given time more than once that this is just a bunch of rabble rousers in Boston. He said that if he could just, said those darn Bostonians, if he could just hang a few people in Boston, surround the army around Massachusetts, he said this will be over. But that's not going to be the case, right? And so Sam Adams, with his circular to create the committees of correspondence throughout the colonies, they brought it back to the Assembly of Massachusetts, and they made them vote it down. They told them with the ultimatum, vote this down. And they voted with British troops surrounding them inside the building as an intimidating force. And they voted 92 against 17 to maintain the committees of correspondence. The British were furious. They said, okay, your assembly is done. They shut down their town hall meetings, their New England city councils. So now representative democracy, technically, right, legally, is now done in Massachusetts. It's legally abolished by the Crown. But of course, it's not, because they're literally going to meet in churches, in taverns, etc. They're going to meet in clandestine places. And then not only are they going to, the politicians, as they break away, but also the members of the militia, right? They're going to split. Some of the militiamen are going to stay loyal to the Crown as Tories and stay to fight for the royal governor and the Crown. And then those who decide to go with the rebels are going to they're going to contend that they will be ready at a minute's notice to fight for the colonists' rights, and hence they call themselves the Minutemen. And later they will fight in militia units, and George Washington will try to amalgamate them into the Continental Army. and fight as patriots. Right. You also had the Mutiny Act, and that did end the New York Assembly because they would not have any of that. In the Mutiny Act, the British troops could come in anytime they wanted into a given home and commandeer anything they wanted from the home, and you could not stop it. So notice it was two things that caused the Tea Party. When they repealed the duties on all these taxes, they kept the tax on one just as a symbol, and that was tea. That was one of the reasons. And then they gave a monopoly to the English East India Company. So those two things caused the Boston Tea Party on December 16th, 1773. 1770, the Boston Massacre began with a fist fight between an American colonist and a soldier. The colonist got the better of him, and the other soldiers chased him, and he actually ran to the soldier's boss because the soldier's boss had a good reputation for keeping his soldiers in check. And as he was trying to talk sense to the soldier's boss and to get him to protect him from the boss's soldiers' wrath, an angry group of colonists threw snowballs and rocks, etc., and began shouting and saying demeaning things to the soldiers. To this day, no one knows for sure if Mr. Preston did say fire or not. They fired into the crowd and killed 5 people. Then pamphlets came out. Of course, Thomas Paine's Common Sense is the one that comes out the most in history, and it's a very aptly named book. It's like 35 pages pamphlet, because it's just, common sense stuff, arguments. America is so much larger and more resource rich than England, so they should be our colony and we should be the mother country rather than the other way around. What is a king historically when you look at the origin of the first king? But the first brute who grabbed a club and knocked and beat over the head weaker, unsuspecting people. And how many times the idea of hereditary kings has a noble, worthy king been followed, succeeded by ignorant, vicious, or weak sons. And he just goes, just makes common sense claims like that, one after another, as to why the system of having a king is foolish and why following England as a colony is foolish, etc. Right? So at any rate, so then the coercive acts really clamped down on Massachusetts, and it elicited the sympathy of the other colonies. And by that time, the First Continental Congress met up, and they tried a last kind of olive branch petition to the king, and he kind of arrogantly set it aside. And by that time, though, they're already using Enlightenment and oppositional philosophers' rhetoric and classical antiquity and Christian rhetoric. So you could tell that some of the stuff that we're going to get into, they're claiming they were influenced by. We'll get into that on number 2. And then Thomas Gage was told that the rebels and the Minutemen were in Concord, Massachusetts, and were training and were gathering an army and arms and ammunition. And he was told to go disband them, arrest them, shoot them on the spot if they refused to throw down their weapons. And on his way to Concord, on the Lexington Green, right, he saw a motley group of people with their weapons. He told them to lay down their guns. They did not. There was supposedly a shot heard around the world, and they fired in and they killed about 13 of the Americans. And he moved his way to Concord, and they were lucky enough, a couple of the founding fathers, to have just made their way out of Concord before capture or worse. And then on their way back, the British, with some of the loot, on their way back to Boston, the Americans, quote, cowardly, began sniping at them and shooting them on the road, from off the road. And then when they came in from the bad weather, the Americans brought in a couple cannon on a place called Dorchester Heights outside of Boston, and got in such a good position on the British that the British felt compelled to leave Boston for the moment, to come back in a bigger force to really start the fighting. And that's when the fighting began in earnest, when the British came back. So yeah, so that's kind of the main gist of it. And then yeah, as far as, you know, that's never been my strongest suit, is the military part of it, but just the heart of it is that the British had us on the rope 2 or 3 times early in the war, and they just didn't finish us off. Literally 2, maybe even 3 times. General Howe, Howe, had the Continental Army like on the tip of Long Island, on the tip of Manhattan, cornered, and did not finish them off. Both times at coming toward an evening, and literally waited until the next morning to do so. And they skedaddled late that night. They got out, escaped that night to be able to fight another day. And they were assisted by the fog. So we got lucky early on in this war. There's no doubt about it. And then the first major big break we got was Saratoga. As you may know, there was a guy named Lord Germain, and Lord Germain had a couple things to his personality that played into our favor. For one, he had an insecurity with Lord Howe that I had already mentioned. Lord Germain was the age of Howe's father, and Germain had been accused of cowardice back in his day in a major battle in Europe. And Howe's father had come to his aid and risked his own reputation to the defense of Lord Germain, and defended him as his friend and comrade. And Germain had never ceased to appreciate that. And it was probably one of the reasons why Germain helped work to put Howe's son in the position that he received here in North America. And so at this point, you see Germain almost be very timid and almost deferential with Howe Jr. when he tells him, when Howe Jr. is in Philadelphia, and he tells you have to read it yourself. And he just tells him basically in a very roundabout way, you know, if you find it expedient, you know, consider coming to Albany, New York, you know, and you can meet with Gentleman Burgoyne and meet forces, etc., etc. But it definitely does not read like a mandate, like a command. All right. And then you add to that Howe, when he was in Philadelphia, he got himself a girlfriend. And I kid you not, and people think, oh, girlfriend, how could that be that big of a deal? But people laugh about it and say, no, he did. He got very serious with a girlfriend. And so he stayed in Philadelphia. So he never went and helped Burgoyne. So when Burgoyne came down um, down toward Albany, right? He took twice as long as he should have. He started going one route and he changed his mind and backtracked to a considerable extent and then came back via another route. Okay. So that hurt him as well. But also, Burgoyne was half the age of the guy who, by all intents and purposes, should have received the position. A guy named Henry Clinton. A man named Henry Clinton, supposedly, if the books I've read are correct, should have received the position that Burgoyne got. All right. Henry Clinton is up in Canada. Henry Clinton was supposed to come down and help Burgoyne, as was Howe, right? So Howe doesn't come and help Burgoyne because it never seemed to have been in the language or the letter any kind of a mandate. So he didn't feel like he really had to. So he doesn't, right? And Clinton is angry because that should have been his position. And so he's like, let Burgoyne lose. I don't care. He was angry. Burgoyne likely got the position. You can Google pictures of him. Burgoyne was a very pretty man, and Lord Germain was homosexual. And so they think that he was smitten with Burgoyne and gave it to Burgoyne because of his looks. So Burgoyne got the position, took way too long to get there. Clinton doesn't help him spitefully. Howe doesn't help him because he doesn't feel he needs to. And Burgoyne takes too long to get there. So before he even gets there, he's still out at Saratoga, and he has the Americans waiting for him, right? And not to mention there's some espionage going on, and the Americans knew when and where he was coming. And so at that time, right, Benjamin Franklin had the ear of Louis XVI, and Louis XVI told him, if your American army can demonstrate to me even once that they can win a considerable battle, he said, so that I know I'm not choosing a losing horse, right? And going into a losing battle. He said, I will join an alliance with the Americans against my hated British and put in a lot of money to help you guys. And it was just perfect timing. And so Burgoyne lasted about a month in the fall and then surrendered. I can't remember how many, but it was a lot. It was tens of thousands of British soldiers. And then Louis XVI said, okay, I'm in. And he signed his treaty with us to help us in the war against Great Britain. So boy, what a stroke of luck, that we got with that, with Saratoga. And we were lucky also with the guerrilla warfare tactics we got from Marquis de Lafayette was something else. Lacombe de Rochambeau, they're right to the end, corrected Washington when Washington wanted to go up to New England, and he talked them out of it to go down to Yorktown, and Yorktown, is where it all ended. Rochambeau was instrumental in that. But also Nathaniel Greene, the young kid that was very awkward and had a bad limp and poor eyesight, but just also kind of ironic. He was a Quaker. Quakers are pacifist. but I read his military history and was really adept at that. We had some really good minds that were good with guerrilla warfare. But mind you, remember, this was a war of attrition. All we had to do was outlast the British. They won more battles than we did. They won more battles than we did, for sure. All right. And so we just had to outlast them. And so this, and matter of fact, some people liken it to their kind of Vietnam. Whenever they lose men and stuff, they began having a lot of fights in their House of Lords and House of Commons, and they would refuse to send more troops from England over here because it was getting too controversial, too costly to send more boys over here to fight and possibly die. So yeah. And when we did have Cornwallis surrender at Yorktown, there were 3 French soldiers for every single American soldier at Yorktown. And they were not going to surrender because he said, Cornwallis said, "Don't worry about me. My help is coming," he said kind of smugly. And then someone asked him, they said, "Well, certainly, sir, you must not be referring to St. Eustatius." And they said he turned white as a ghost because that's exactly where his confidence was coming from. But at St. Eustatius, the French Navy had the island surrounded and kept his help from coming. So the French really did, they were very vital in helping us militarily win our war for independence. So I know we were a vital help to the French in World War II, against Nazi Germany. But they too were of help for us in our independence. All right. So anyway, number 1, okay, is the British view. This is the British view to this day of our war for independence. All right. It is 2 realms, in the political realm and in the economic realm. The British supposedly left us alone and we strengthened ourselves. We took advantage of it. We benefited from it. All right. By their neglect. Hence, salutary, healthy neglect thesis, right? So look at that, look through it, even if you don't choose number 1, and look at the examples I give from Paul Johnson's book about assemblies gaining power after power over their own governors, over their own councils, okay? Power to tax, power to control their governor's salaries. Some of them are just crazy, right? They're just gaining these powers. Because remember, the English common law is that that powers are organic. You gain them in time. You gain them by increments, like a growing living organism, right? So at any rate, you gain them this way. So Franklin Roosevelt, he had done his homework, just like Paul Johnson did in his history book here. And Benjamin Franklin did his homework and went back to England and said, "Guys, in this year right here, the Assembly of Pennsylvania gained the power to do this, to oversee this. The Assembly of New York could do this at this given year." And he just did a list of things, right, that each assembly had acquired at a given year, and said, so to him, at those junctures, from those times on, those assemblies had now had entitlement to those rights, right? But the Parliament arrogantly stated, we were not aware of that. We do not acknowledge that. And we have the right to revoke that. And what do you say to that, right? And Benjamin Franklin was just furious. He had nothing he could say to that. But at this point, right, with number one, that's beside the point. To number one, the Americans, they didn't know that yet. And so they just felt they're living large. They felt absolutely entitled to these changes, right? To this growth of empowerment. And then after the political enhancements that you see, I change it to economic enhancements. You see smuggling. They smuggled whatever they wanted, right? They engaged in skilled work, artisanry, whatever they did, whatever they wanted. They went and squatted on land and cash crop farmed virtually wherever they wanted. And then at the end of the French and Indian War, right? The British say, hey, well, wait a minute. We're going to start enforcing some of these rules, right? So look what it says at the bottom. They were not fed up with restrictions and tyranny. They merely fought to keep a good thing going. Okay? So to this day, you guys, from what I understand, this is a common interpretation, the salutary neglect thesis, in England itself. So, oh, the Americans act like we were tyrants over them. Yeah, right. They're spoiled brats. They had it really well. They had it too well. Then we tried to enforce a little bit of rules, a little bit of, restrictions. Then the spoiled brats just, So anyway, that's number one, okay? The salutary neglect thesis. That we fought to keep a good thing going. There was no enforcement of the mercantilist restrictions, right? And there was no really oversight over our assemblies and what they were up to. Okay. And number two is court history. All right. So remember, I might tie it on the test to this last name. So remember this last name, Bernard Bailyn. Bernard Bailyn says, okay, that in the 1740s, going up to the time of the War for Independence, that these special, idealistic, lofty ideas started spreading across Europe and the Atlantic. Okay. And the first people to gain access to them were the intelligentsia, right? The most educated of our Americans. The guys who were the small elite who were college educated and were able to read books even in French. So like Thomas Jefferson and Benjamin Franklin and John Dickinson. Okay. They said they read this stuff, right? But then they used the press. They used the word of mouth. And they spread a great summation, a great concise summation of what they read in these books to the masses so that the masses could understand it. So that even the masses of people, many of whom were just basically or maybe not even literate, could become enlightened. So the French Enlightenment. The deists, right? They said whatever is natural is healthy, right? And is rational. So hence, freedom, equality, accountability, humanitarianism. That is what is in tune with the natural world and universe. Tyranny, inequality, privilege, arbitrary power, intolerance, corruption, those are all what cause woes and suffering and all that's wrong with the world. Ignorance, superstition, manipulation, greed. That's all what's wrong with the world. Yeah. Okay. So Voltaire, he stressed freedom of conscience. Diderot and Condorcet, education and free thinking for all. Montesquieu, checks and balances in government. Rousseau, and of course, a lot of you have heard of Rousseau and Locke, right? The social contract, that governments are derived by the consent of the governed, and they are by our permission, and they are our servants, not our bosses, right? So everything I've covered so far is the French Enlightenment. Yeah. Okay. Then the Scottish Enlightenment. Let's see here. Sorry. where I talk about something I want to highlight. Scottish Enlightenment. So I have here create impediments to tyranny.
What?
Create impediments to tyranny.
Okay.
So keep power small, localized, transparent. Let's see here. Keep power small, localized, transparent. Keep terms short. Citizens bear arms. They were big on bearing arms, the Scots. What else? Anyway, stuff like that. Etc. You get the point. And then you also have the Great Awakening. And this was religious, right?
Mm-hmm.
Deference to, I'm going to put this in a parentheses, because it during the Great Awakening it was to your religious leaders, but it carried over, okay, to basically to all your leaders, not just religious. Okay. But does that help a little bit? Okay. So deference to your religious leaders. And remember, deference means knowing your place, showing proper obedience, and doing as you're told, right? So deference to religious leaders, or deference to leaders, becomes conditional. Are they worthy? Are they following God? Okay. So the Great Awakening, it was against the Anglican clergy. And they were saying that a lot of the Anglican priests were not following God. And it was almost like a form of like civil disobedience, where they were defying the Anglican priests, saying, well, they're not following God, so it's okay for us. It's even okay with God for us to defy them. And a lot of people believe that that carried over to the War for Independence. They were saying that King George III and some of the other people were had lost God's favor, and that it was okay for them to defy him, that he was no longer God's anointed. That you see that on some of their posters, etc., that they made in some of their propaganda against the king. So you look at all this, right? And you find it, you guys, in a lot of the people's pamphlets, their posters, their speeches, and so forth. So Bernard Bailyn says that these types of movements, the French Enlightenment, the Scottish Enlightenment, the Great Awakening, he said that they had a oh, and one more, I'm sorry. The classical era. Especially Rome.
Rome.
Yep. So tyrant, anti-models, right? And as you could guess, an anti-model, right, is the opposite of a model, someone that you showing everybody that you should not be like.
Mhm.
So of course, you had King the George III likened to Caligula, Nero, etc. Right?
Mhm. Not good.
And then you had George Washington. Likened to Cicero and Tacitus of Rome, who supposedly exemplified civic virtue of putting the needs of the community above their own
Mhm.
during the age of the Republic. All right.
Mhm.
So yeah, that's Bernard Bailyn. It's called The Ideological Origins of the Revolution. It's an interesting book. Okay. And it just talks about that. It talks about how he thinks this was not about greed and blood and power, but he thinks that it was about ideas and about how these ideas that were spreading at the time were making people enlightened and making them fight for these general principles, right?
Mhm.
Number 3, George Washington. Okay, his and the father's ideal steeped in self-interest. Now, I want to make sure that you guys catch one little nuance to number 3, okay? Because that little nuance is the only little tricky part to this. Otherwise, it's very obvious.
Okay.
Is when you read this one, George Washington is very ambitious, going for his own. He tries to get a military position. Braddock gets it instead. He's angry about it. Even when Braddock gets killed, getting the position that he wanted, he still says hateful things about Braddock after Braddock dies. He's very selfishly ambitious. He gets mad about the way the middlemen treat his farm produce. He wants to trade his own farm produce, and he hates that these middlemen are taking his stuff and selling it for him. And yeah, so you have that. And so you definitely see a greedy, entitled side to him. That there's no hiding that, right? But the one
Mhm.
thing that there's a nuanced side to it, okay, is the one thing that I could say slightly in his defense is to him, right? This whole British system is it's what's the word? I'm trying to think of an adjective. It's
Gets in the way.
clumsy and it's unfair. Okay. Is to him, right? It's not just about him. Is if it weren't him getting Braddock's position. It should be someone else getting Braddock's position. That the British Army needs the best guy getting that position instead of Braddock getting it. That to him, Braddock was an idiot, and he was costing soldiers their lives, having Braddock get the position. And you know what I mean? And so at any rate, he hates the system. To him, the most qualified person should get the job, period. Whoever is the best, the most talented should get the position. And whoever could sell his produce the most, with the most skill should be able to do it. And so if it's he himself who could sell his farm produce the best, then he should be able to do it himself. You know what I mean? So to him, he wants them to live in a world that's based on merit, that's based on whoever deserves, whoever merits, can do it the best, should do it, period. And so, yes, it doesn't obviate, it doesn't do away with the fact that he is a selfish, ambitious man that you'll read on number 3. But it's still, like I said, it's a little bit nuanced that way. And I meant it that way when I read this book, is that, but he's not just a selfish jerk. He wants to live in a world outside the British world where it's not by connection. It's not just by, a stupid connection that you get or don't get something, but it should be the most qualified. Okay. All right. So let's go down to number 4. This one is a cynical thesis, man. All right. This one says, okay, prior to the War for Independence, the poor on the western side of the states had no representation from the assemblymen. No, the assemblymen are the well-to-do colonials. They're not the Brits, right? They're not the Brits. So guess what? These well-to-do colonials are going to be the ones who become later the founding fathers. You think about, like, for instance, Google the founding fathers and Google the Constitutional Convention and, like, take a look at them. They're not a mini example. They are not a microcosm of their population, are they? They're super rich looking. Most of them went to college, when in reality, what, like less than 1% of their generation went to college. Like most of them were lawyers, when like less than 1% of their generation were lawyers. Like they were the cream of the crop, these guys, right? So here they were, right? These well-to-do future founding fathers, serving as the elected assemblymen, and these dirty-faced, illiterate country bumpkins to the west of them are coming and saying, hey, I'm having trouble with my farming, my stuff. I need help with, I'm not getting enough rain. I need help with some feed and I need some manure to help with the soil, and I need this. And, and you get the picture of them saying, that's not my problem, man. Go back. Sorry. And we're getting attacked. The natives are shooting arrows at us, and hey, we're at peace with those natives. We're not going to go over there and fight those natives for you. Go back. It's not our problem. So you have evidence of those poor people in the West writing letters to the governor over the heads of their elected reps, saying our elected reps care nothing about us. They're just parasites, enriching their own pockets. They care nothing about us. Is there something you can do to help us? Now imagine that, they're in a few years, they're going to end up fighting against that governor because he's a Brit, and they're complaining to that Brit about the assemblymen who are going to end up being their leading officers in the Continental Army. You know what I mean? How in the world did that happen? And so, according to Howard Zinn, is through pure manipulation. Is when all the drama starts happening over the stamp tax and all these different tax issues and the mob rule and all that and stuff. He said the future founding fathers, the assemblymen, they said they saw the revolutionary potential of the mobs and of the poor, and they thought, I don't want their wrath to indiscriminately go toward everybody that's rich, because it might turn toward us too, right? And you have some quotes, you guys, from people like John Adams, the founding fathers like John Adams, who told his cousin Sam Adams, like, hey man, we don't want them mad at us too. The masses seem to love you, Sam. Tell them not to be mad at us, that the enemy is the British, not us. You have quotes similar to that. And so Howard Zinn, you got to keep in mind, Howard Zinn is a Marxist historian. He's always for the poor and always thinks the rich are the villains. But still, it's something to think about. Is he said that, the future founding fathers, these assemblymen, that they were old foxes, shrewd foxes. And they said, hey man, we need to deflect the poor's anger. They've had a lot to be angry about. And now everything's getting, tempestuous during all this rebellion. We need to deflect their anger away from us. And we need to use the British as a scapegoat and tell them that everything they're mad at is to blame. The British are to blame for, right? And we need to use the carrot and the stick to get them to fight for us. We need to tell them that we need to be strict with them and then like enlist them and tell them like have harsh discipline at times. And George Washington, he had cases where he could be really harsh as the leader of the Continental Army, and then sometimes offer them great things, offer them bond certificates, offer them land, etc. And then at the same time also just promise them great things like what we read on number 2. Promise them like the equality of all men, the social contract, offer them, these great things, right? With government, that we're going to have a much more enlightened government once we kick the British out, and it'll be a much more amenable to them, this the government that we're going to have in the future, as kind of a carrot dangling in front of them to keep them going, to keep them fighting for us, because we can't be honest with them and say we don't really think much of you, but we need you to fight and die for us and kind of be our cannon fodder on the battlefield for us, because we want the British out so we can be the top dog standing. No, you use all that nice rhetoric that Bernard Bailyn talked about, or the French Enlightenment, Scottish Enlightenment, the Great Awakening. You use that as convenient, manipulative propaganda to get the poor going. I don't know. What do you guys think? That's pretty dark, isn't it?
Yeah.
I hope it's not too true. Yeah. So yeah, that was the last one, guys. That's number 4. That's Howard Zinn, His People's History of the U.S. It's that's the way his book runs. Real kind of dark that way.
Yeah.
All right. So you guys have any questions or comments?
Mm.
All right. I think I'm going to give you guys a couple extra points today.
Yeah. Thank you.
We went really long today.
Yeah. That's cool.
Yeah, you've earned it. All right. Well, you guys have a good day then, okay?
Thanks, teacher.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Have a good one.
You too.
Bye-bye.